The Thornfield plantation sat on the edge of Memphis like a scar pressed into the land. 3,000 acres of cotton and sorrow stretched along the Mississippi's slow waters. The house itself rose high on a hill, whitewashed wood glinting in the sunlight, its tall columns meant to resemble the pride of Rome, though its foundation was laid in blood and tears. The fields around it shimmered in summer heat, heavy with green plants waiting to be picked clean by hands that were never paid, voices that sang to keep from breaking, bodies bent in rhythm not of their choosing. The house was filled with laughter and wine when guests arrived, yet the walls carried muffled cries and the echo of whips that cracked long after dusk. To the world, Thornfield was a symbol of wealth and prosperity. But to those trapped within its shadow, it was a grave without earth. Isabella lived in that house, though not as a guest or daughter. She worked in the kitchen, where smoke and sweat clung to every surface, and where days began before sunrise and ended after the last candle was put out. She was 27, her face older than her years, her hands scarred from knives and fire, her back stiff from stooping to scrub floors until they gleamed for those who would never thank her. She had once been sold on a block in Memphis, her worth measured in dollars and muscle, her name shouted by men who called her strong, broad, and capable. She was purchased for $800 by Henry Thornfield, the patriarch who prided himself on acquiring only the best for his estate. Her husband was sold in the same hour to another man heading south. She never saw him again. Her daughter Amelia, born in Thornfield's back quarters, became her reason to keep breathing. The Thornfield family held their place as rulers of this corner of Tennessee. Henry was the master, broad-shouldered, his hair gray, his voice always commanding, though it was his children who would one day inherit everything. Robert, the eldest son, carried himself like a king. He rode horses across the fields with a whip in his hand, punishing anyone who slowed beneath the sun. Charles, younger by 3 years, had a cruel humor and liked to watch others squirm. He would sit on the porch, sipping whiskey, calling for enslaved men to fight each other for his amusement. Eleanor and Josephine, the daughters, mirrored their brother's arrogance. They wore silks and ribbons brought from New Orleans and Paris, turning up their noses at the women who cooked their food and washed their linens, laughing behind fans when they passed by. To Isabella, each of them was a storm she had to pass through. She learned to walk quietly, to bow her head when spoken to hide her thoughts behind lowered eyes. Yet within her silence, she studied everything, the way Robert barked orders, the way Charles drank too much and slurred his threats, the way Josephine demanded her dresses pressed twice a day, the way Eleanor scolded servants for dust no one else could see. She noticed the bottles kept in the pantry, the herbs growing along the edge of the garden, the powders in glass jars labeled for fevers and aches. Her work gave her access to every corner of the house, and she carried each detail like a seed stored for a future season. The quarters stood in neat rows behind the fields, small wooden shacks that barely held warmth in winter or air in summer. The cries of babies echoed through their thin walls, joined by the coughs of the old who had no strength left. At night, the enslaved gathered quietly, whispering songs of home and freedom, clinging to hope the way roots cling to earth. Isabella often sat with her daughter under the stars, telling her stories of rivers that led to better lands, of a God who heard even the prayers said in silence. She told Amelia never to forget that she was more than what the Thornfields said she was, that her name carried a meaning no whip could erase. Yet inside, Isabella felt fear tighten like a rope each day. Amelia was growing, her body no longer a child's, and she had seen the way Robert's eyes lingered too long, the way Charles's laughter turned sharp when Amelia walked by. The House of Thornfield was not only a prison, but a stage where cruelty performed itself daily. On Sundays, the family sat in pews at the local church, nodding as the preacher declared slavery the will of God. Isabella and the others stood at the back, their eyes lowered, listening to words meant to chain their souls as firmly as their bodies. The hypocrisy settled heavy in her chest, yet she never spoke it aloud. She carried her rage deep within, buried under layers of silence, waiting. The Mississippi flowed just beyond the plantation's edge, its waters dark and slow, carrying boats north and south. To the Thornfields, it was a highway for trade, a channel of cotton and wealth. To Isabella, it was a whisper, a reminder that the world was wider than these fields, that somewhere beyond the water lay lands where no man could own another. At night, when the air cooled and crickets sang, she imagined herself walking along that riverbank with Amelia, free feet on free soil. She imagined not waking to the sound of chains, not fearing the next sail or the next beating, not living each day with her heart clenched in her chest. The house of Thornfield stood proud, but it was built on lies. Its columns could not hide the screams, its fine furniture could not cover the stains of blood, its wealth could not silence the truth that every brick and board was laid on broken backs. Isabella knew this better than anyone, and though she had no weapon yet, no plan formed in full, she carried inside her something far more dangerous than any blade or chain. She carried patience, memory, and a will that had not been broken. In that silence, the first seeds of her story were already growing. Cruelty at Thornfield did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. It was not only the lash that marked the skin, but the daily cutting away of dignity. It came in the words spoken carelessly at supper, in the laughter of masters who found humor in suffering, in the commands barked at dawn when the fields still glistened with dew. It was in the way Robert Thornfield would ride his horse through the rows just to scatter the workers, enjoying the chaos as if human beings were nothing more than birds startled from corn. It was in the way Charles leaned against the fence rails, drinking from his flask, daring men twice his age to falter so he could punish them. Isabella carried these sights within her, though she never allowed her face to reveal more than silence. Her daughter grew in this world, each day shaping her like clay pressed too hard. Amelia was 6 when Isabella first noticed her shadow stretching into girlhood, the lines of childhood softening into something the men around them would not ignore. That fear consumed Isabella in secret. She knew what happened when daughters came of age on plantations. She had heard the cries muffled through thin walls, had seen young girls carried off and returned hollow. She could not bear to imagine her daughter swallowed by the same cruelty that had shaped her own life. The cruelty extended even to the smallest details of daily living. When Josephine tired of her dress, Isabella was forced to mend it late into the night, pricking her fingers until blood stained the thread. When Eleanor misplaced her ribbons, Isabella searched on her knees across polished floors until her hands ached. The smallest mistake became a reason for punishment. A pot left too long on the fire, a spoon misplaced, a look misread, each could lead to blows or worse. And yet Isabella endured, because to endure was the only shield she had. Her survival depended not on strength but on silence, not on defiance but on patience. There were moments when cruelty dressed itself as kindness. Eleanor sometimes offered Amelia a leftover sweet, her voice dripping with false warmth, as though generosity could erase the reality of chains. Josephine would laugh as Amelia tried on old bonnets, treating her like a doll to be entertained, never seeing the humiliation beneath the surface. Isabella thanked them when required, bowing her head, but inside she burned with a quiet fury. Every crumb of kindness was offered only to remind them of their place. At night, in the quarters, Isabella saw the scars others carried. Men broken from years in the fields, women who rocked empty arms where children once lay, elders who whispered prayers that seemed to rise no higher than the smoke from the chimney. Stories traveled among them like wind. Stories of men whipped until their backs were nothing but torn flesh. Stories of women sold away from their babies. Stories of men who tried to run and were brought back chained and beaten until they no longer walked straight. Each story carved into Isabella's memory until it formed a wall inside her, a place where anger lived beside grief. The cruelty of Thornfield was not unique. It was ordinary. That ordinariness was its greatest violence. The Thornfields did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as rightful owners, guardians of order, pillars of their community. They bowed their heads in church, they dined with neighbors, they sent their children to be educated in the North. To them, cruelty was not cruelty at all. It was simply life as it had always been. That truth stung Isabella more deeply than the whip itself. It meant the suffering she endured was invisible to those who caused it. It meant her pain did not exist in their world. Isabella knew she could not stop the cruelty. She could not soften Robert's voice when he barked orders, could not close Charles's eyes when they lingered too long, could not erase the smirk from Eleanor's lips when she ordered a dress pressed again and again. But she could carry her silence as armor, and within that silence she stored each act of cruelty like a stone in her pocket. Heavy, yes, but also useful. She did not know yet how she would use them, but she knew one day those stones would be needed. The weight grew heavier when Thornfield's debts deepened. Whispers of sale floated through the quarters like smoke. Names were spoken in hushed tones. Families clung tighter to each other. Mothers held their children as though arms could stop the traitor's hand. Isabella listened and waited, fear sharpening into dread when she heard Amelia's name carried on those whispers. She had begged before, had pleaded on her knees, but property had no voice. She was reminded of that again when Henry Thornfield told her plainly that Amelia would be sold. A child turned into coin, her future weighed against debt. The cruelty that had once been scattered across days and hours now pressed itself into Isabella's chest like a blade. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She watched Amelia breathe at night, watched the child's chest rise and fall, and knew that each breath might be her last in that house. She imagined Amelia taken, placed in a wagon, her small hands reaching back for a mother who could not follow. The thought hollowed Isabella until there was nothing left but resolve. Cruelty had been her life's constant companion, but now it became her teacher. It showed her that silence could no longer be enough. It showed her that patience could not protect Amelia from the auction block. It showed her that endurance, though it had carried her this far, would not save her daughter. Cruelty had stripped her of everything but choice, and that choice narrowed each day until only one path remained. Isabella carried that weight until she could no longer bear it, and when the moment came, she knew what she must do. The first spark did not come like a sudden flame, but like the slow strike of flint against stone. Isabella had carried silence for so long it had become a second skin, but inside her mind thoughts gathered like storm clouds. She began to notice small details others overlooked. The way roots left in the sun darkened and hardened, the way berries lost their sweetness when left too long in a bowl, the way bitter herbs when steeped could clear a cough but in larger measure could still a body altogether. She stored each observation, not because she yet knew what to do with them, but because the mind, once awakened, cannot turn away. There was an elder in the quarters named Rachel, her back bent and her eyes sharp, who was said to know every plant that grew along the riverbank. She had healed cuts, soothed burns, and calmed fevers with her herbs. People came to her in the night, seeking both cure and comfort, and she gave what she could, whispering words that sounded older than the land itself. Isabella gravitated to her quietly, helping her gather weeds and roots, listening as Rachel spoke about the earth and its gifts. Rachel did not speak of poison, but Isabella listened between her words, understanding that every cure had a shadow side. Rachel saw the weight Isabella carried, but never asked directly. Perhaps she knew the shape of a mother's fear without needing it spoken. One night, as they sorted dried leaves, Rachel paused and looked at Isabella with eyes that seemed to pierce through silence. "The earth gives us what we need," she said simply, laying a root in Isabella's hand. "It can heal or it can harm. It depends on how we use it." That was all she said, but the words burned in Isabella's chest long after. The quarters hummed with whispers of resistance. Not open talk, not anything that could be overheard by ears too eager to punish, but small stories carried like embers. There were tales of a woman in Virginia who slipped powder into a master's drink. There were tales of men who set fire to barns and fled into the swamps. Most stories ended in capture, in torture, in death, but the telling of them still mattered. They were reminders that people could fight back, that cruelty could be answered. Isabella listened, and though fear pressed against her, the stories gave her something else too, a vision of possibility. Late at night, when Amelia slept, Isabella began to scratch words on scraps of paper she found discarded in the house. She had learned her letters in secret from another woman years before, keeping that knowledge hidden like a forbidden jewel. Now she used it to record fragments of thought, prayers, and pieces of a plan that was not yet a plan. She hid the scraps beneath a loose board, careful to leave no trace behind. Writing did not make her burden lighter, but it made it clearer. Each word was like a step toward something she could not yet name. Her heart hardened when she saw Robert linger near Amelia, his eyes carrying a hunger that made her skin crawl. Each day brought him closer, each smile a warning of what was coming. Isabella had known men like him before, men who took what they wished without question, who believed their power was unquestionable. She could not allow him to touch her daughter. The thought became a wall inside her mind, blocking out everything else. She began to move through her days with a different kind of focus, her silence no longer only a shield, but a mask behind which she prepared. The kitchen became her place of observation. She handled jars, bottles, and sacks of herbs every day. She knew which ones sweetened pies, which ones thickened stews, which ones eased pain. She began to linger longer, to test textures with her fingers, to taste the bitterness of leaves when no one watched. No single act seemed suspicious, but each was a step closer to knowledge she was not supposed to have. She learned which roots could stop a heart if ground fine enough, which seeds could turn the stomach sour, which powders could mask themselves in sauces rich with butter. Her resolve grew not from anger alone, but from love. Each time Amelia ran to her, arms flung wide, laughter spilling like water, Isabella felt both joy and terror. Joy because her child was still hers. Terror because she knew that joy could be snatched away at any moment. Love sharpened her mind, gave her courage she did not know she had. It whispered that patience had ended, that silence could no longer be enough. In the evenings, as she worked by the firelight, Isabella caught Samuel watching her. He was a young man, strong in build but quiet, his eyes steady in a way that made him seem older. He seemed to sense her thoughts, though she never spoke them. One night, when their paths crossed outside the smokehouse, he said only, "Whatever you're thinking, I'll stand with you." He offered no questions, no conditions. That promise planted itself in her heart like a seed. She did not answer him, but she did not forget. The spark of resistance had taken root. It was still hidden, still fragile, but it glowed inside her like an ember that could not be smothered. She moved through her days as though nothing had changed, bowing her head, obeying commands, tending to chores. But beneath the surface she carried fire. Each cruel word spoken by Robert, each careless laugh from Charles, each command from Eleanor and Josephine fed that fire. And with each passing day, she came closer to the moment when she would no longer hold it back. The house at Thornfield stirred with excitement when word came of the grand gathering. Henry Thornfield, eager to display his wealth despite the quiet shadow of debt, declared there would be a supper unlike any held in recent memory. He invited neighbors from plantations upriver, young heirs eager for drink and song, women who wore silks brought from New Orleans, and men who boasted of cotton prices as though they owned the very river itself. Preparations began at once, and as always the burden fell upon those who would never sit at the table. For Isabella, this was no longer another night of servitude. It was the chance she had been waiting for. She listened as orders were given, her head bowed though her mind was already arranging details none of them could imagine. Eleanor demanded extra dishes, Josephine fussed over arrangements, Robert requested bottles of the best wine, and Charles laughed about how the night would stretch until dawn. Isabella nodded at each command, memorizing every instruction as though it were sacred, though she carried her own plan beneath her silence. The supper would be filled with laughter and light, but beneath the surface it would carry the weight of her decision. In the kitchen, the air grew heavy with smoke and heat. Pots boiled, ovens glowed, knives clattered against wooden boards. Isabella moved among them with calm precision, each motion practiced from years of repetition. Yet her hands lingered longer over the jars of herbs, her eyes studied the powders that lined the shelves. She knew which dishes would reach the heirs' plates, which sauces they favored, which wines they drank until their speech slurred and their bodies sagged. She marked them carefully, like a seamstress measuring cloth before the cut. Samuel watched her with quiet understanding. He carried firewood, hauled water, and kept the overseer distracted when Isabella needed a moment unobserved. He asked no questions, offered no words that might betray them if overheard. Instead, he gave her the gift of space, the brief seconds where she could reach for what she needed. It was in those seconds she slipped the pieces of her plan into place. Roots ground fine enough to vanish into thick gravy, seeds crushed into powder that would blend with wine, bitter leaves boiled until their strength was drawn out. She measured carefully, her mind steady as a scale. Every step was weighed against risk. Too much, and suspicion would fall upon the kitchen. Too little, and the heirs might survive. She thought of Amelia each time doubt crept in, imagined her daughter taken from her arms, her laughter replaced with silence. That thought hardened Isabella more than anything. She moved with the care of someone who understood she was not simply cooking a meal, but shaping the end of a house. The night before the supper, Isabella could not sleep. The quarters hummed with the usual sounds of rest, but her eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling above. She heard Amelia breathing beside her, soft and steady, and she prayed without words. She prayed not for safety, but for strength. She prayed that her hands would not tremble, that her resolve would not falter. She prayed that the silence she had carried for so long would finally give way to action. When dawn came, the household stirred earlier than usual. Guests would arrive by evening, and every room had to gleam. Isabella worked through the day, her face calm though her heart beat with a steady drum. She polished silver until it caught the light, arranged dishes with the precision of a craftsman, and carried platters that seemed to weigh more than her own body. Each task brought her closer to the moment she had prepared for, each step measured and deliberate. By afternoon, the house smelled of roasted meats and spiced pies, of sauces simmering and bread rising. Servants hurried across polished floors, candles were placed in holders, and laughter floated in from the veranda where Robert and Charles drank early with their companions. Isabella slipped among them unseen, her presence expected yet unnoticed, her silence blending her into the background. No one imagined the thoughts that moved behind her steady gaze. No one guessed that the dishes they praised so often would carry something more than flavor that night. As the sun began to set, carriages rolled up the long drive, wheels crunching against gravel. Guests stepped down, their voices bright with anticipation, their clothes shimmering in the fading light. Inside, candles flickered against walls, music stirred from the parlor, and glasses filled with wine that seemed endless. Isabella carried her platters to the table, placing each one with hands that did not tremble. She watched as laughter filled the room, as Robert boasted to his friends, as Charles slapped shoulders and poured drink after drink. The stage was set, and Isabella knew there would be no turning back. Every detail was fixed, every choice made. The supper would proceed as they had planned, but beneath their celebration lay her quiet rebellion. She had woven her decision into the very fabric of the night, hidden in sauces and wine, unseen yet certain. The heirs would not leave the table as they had come, and when the first toast was raised, Isabella stood in the corner of the room, her face calm, her silence unbroken, carrying within her the fire that had been waiting too long. Evening fell heavy over Thornfield, the kind of darkness that settled deep, pressing against the windows as if eager to witness what unfolded inside. The house glowed with candles, their flames throwing long shadows across polished wood and bright silver. Laughter filled the air, loud and careless, spilling from the dining hall like a river. Glasses clinked, forks scraped, voices rose in boasts and songs. To the guests it was a night of triumph, a celebration of wealth and power. To Isabella it was a reckoning. She moved quietly between the tables, her hands steady as she carried platters to the hungry heirs and their companions. They called for more wine, more meat, more sauce, their voices thick with drink and arrogance. Isabella served them all, bowing her head, letting her silence shield her as it always had. No one saw the way her eyes measured each mouthful, No one guessed that each swallow brought them closer to a truth they could not escape. Robert sat at the head, flushed with drink, his laughter sharp as he bragged of new lands he planned to buy. Charles leaned back in his chair, waving his glass with careless ease, mocking the servants who hurried at his call. Eleanor and Josephine whispered behind their hands, eyes bright with cruelty as they judged the dresses of the women across the table. Around them, neighbors cheered and jested, never pausing to notice the quiet storm rising in their midst. Isabella saw it all. She absorbed every detail as though imprinting the scene upon her soul. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The guests ate greedily, voices rising with every round of wine. The meat was praised, the pies devoured, the sauces savored with delight. Isabella's face remained still, her hands calm as she cleared and replaced dishes. But inside her chest, her heart beat like a drum, not with fear now, but with finality. The plan had been set in motion, and nothing could call it back. The first cough broke through the laughter like a crack in glass. It was small, barely noticed, a man clearing his throat after too much drink. Then another cough came, sharper, followed by a gasp. A woman set her fork down, her hand pressed against her stomach, her face paling. Robert reached for his wine to laugh it off, but his hand trembled as the glass slipped, shattering against the floor. The room shifted then, laughter faltering, eyes turning in confusion. Charles tried to speak, but his words stumbled, slurred not with drink, but with something deeper. He clutched at his throat, his face blotched red, then gray. Eleanor shrieked as Josephine doubled over, her hands clawing at the tablecloth, pulling dishes to the ground in a clatter of silver and porcelain. Panic rose like fire, spreading through the room as one by one the guests felt the sickness strike. Cries filled the hall, chairs toppled, bodies bent with pain. Isabella stood in the corner, her hands folded before her, her eyes steady. She did not smile, did not flinch. She only watched as the house that had pressed its cruelty upon her now choked on its own feast. Robert fell forward, his face striking the table, his boast silenced mid-breath. Charles gasped, clutching at nothing as his body slid to the floor. Eleanor's screams turned hoarse. Josephine's sobs broke into silence. The guests staggered, some clawing for the door, others collapsing where they stood. The music had long ceased, the only sound now the chaos of fear and death. Servants rushed about, some crying, others frozen in terror. Calls went out for doctors, for priests, for anyone who could explain the madness, but no cure came, no explanation that could save them. Isabella moved with the same quiet composure she had carried all her life, slipping through the shadows of the hall. No one stopped her. No one noticed her absence. All eyes were fixed upon the fallen heirs, the once proud family undone by what they could neither see nor name. For years, Isabella had endured their cruelty in silence. Now silence was her weapon. She left behind no confession, no cry of victory, only the memory of her calm presence as the house crumbled around its table. The weight of years of suffering shifted within her, not gone, not lightened, but changed into something else, a force that had broken chains, if only for her and her child. As the night deepened, chaos still reigned in Thornfield, but Isabella was already gone from the room where it all began. She had carried out her plan with the patience of stone, with the love of a mother who refused to surrender her child. Behind her, the house echoed with cries of pain and fear, but before her lay only the quiet of the night. And in that quiet, she found not peace, not yet, but a path. The cries still carried behind her as Isabella stepped into the night, but they no longer touched her. The house that had been a prison of brick and shadow now seemed to tremble in its own sickness, its walls unable to contain the chaos within. She did not look back. Every step forward was a choice, and she knew that if she faltered even once, she and her child would be swallowed again by the world she had just left behind. The air outside was heavy with the scent of wet earth and magnolia, the moon veiled in drifting clouds. Isabella held her daughter close, the child's breath warm against her neck, her small body wrapped in the single shawl Isabella had managed to keep. The night was thick with silence except for the sounds of insects humming and frogs croaking in the distance. It was a different kind of music than the one she had left behind. This was the sound of life, not death. She moved quickly toward the tree line, the path known to her not by sight, but by memory. For months, she had studied the land in secret, memorizing the bends of the creek, the direction of the moss on the trees, the distance between the lanterns that marked the outer edge of the property. Every detail had been stored away for this night, every thought shaped by the hope of escape. Now those details guided her through the dark like stars unseen. Behind her, bells began to toll, first one, then another. The house had discovered its ruin, and the alarm spread like fire through the quarters. Dogs barked, their deep voices cutting through the stillness. Men shouted, their boots pounding the earth, calling for order, calling for answers. Isabella pressed deeper into the trees, her steps quick but steady. She had expected this, counted on the confusion that would scatter them for precious minutes. Those minutes were hers now, and she used them with the cold clarity of someone who knew what waited if she failed. The swamp lay ahead, black water reflecting the moonlight in broken fragments. It was a place many feared, full of snakes, biting insects, and mud that could swallow a body whole. But Isabella saw not danger but shelter. The swamp did not ask questions, did not demand obedience. It only demanded respect and that she was ready to give. She waded in, the water cool against her legs, her child held high above her chest. Each step was heavy, the mud sucking at her feet, but she kept on, her breath even, her gaze fixed forward. The shouts grew fainter, swallowed by the dense trees and the cries of night creatures. The dogs barked still, but the swamp confused them, its water carrying scents away, its reeds masking every movement. Isabella knew the land was on her side now. She moved as if she belonged to it, sliding through cattails, ducking beneath low branches, finding small ridges where her feet could rest. The child stirred once, whimpering softly, but Isabella hushed her with a gentle touch, whispering words of comfort that had no sound. Hours passed, measured not by clocks, but by the slow crawl of darkness. Isabella kept moving, though her body ached and her muscles burned. Each step forward felt like a small victory, though fear walked beside her with every breath. She knew the patrols would not stop when dawn came. They would search the roads, the fields, the rivers. Her face would be burned into their memory, her name cursed at every table. They would not rest until she was returned or confirmed dead. But Isabella had prepared for more than the first night. She knew where the river bent northward, where a group of free men and women had been whispered about in the quarters, people who risked their own lives to guide the hunted toward safety. She did not know their names or faces, only the signs that marked their presence, a lantern left in a certain window, a piece of cloth tied to a fence post, a song carried faintly in the air. These were the beacons she followed, faith stitched into secrecy. The moon sank lower, the sky paling at its edges. Dawn crept like a quiet hand across the horizon, painting the swamp in shades of gray. Isabella reached a patch of higher ground where cypress roots twisted into shapes like cages. She sank against one, her body trembling, her child asleep in her arms. For the first time, she allowed herself a breath that was not held, though it carried no relief. Rest was a luxury she could not afford, but she needed strength for what lay ahead. She thought then of the faces she had left behind, the masters who had laughed at her suffering, the heirs who had mocked her silence, the family who believed they could break her spirit. Their cries still echoed in her mind, not as torment, but as warning. She had seen how quickly power crumbled when faced with truth. Their downfall was not her freedom, not yet, but it was the beginning. As the first rays of sun touched the water, Isabella rose again. She tightened the shawl around her child, lifted her chin, and stepped deeper into the unknown. The path ahead was long, and danger would follow, but the night had carried her this far. If the swamp could hide her, if the river could carry her, if strangers could see her humanity before her chains, then perhaps freedom was not just a word whispered in secret, but a place she could reach with her own 2 feet. And so she walked, her figure small against the vastness of the land, but steady, unbroken. The flight into darkness had begun, and the dawn, though uncertain, was hers to claim. The road north was nothing like the paths Isabella had known in Memphis. It was wide, muddy from recent rains, and littered with remnants of human toil. Broken cartwheels, discarded barrels, footprints fading into the dirt. Each step required careful judgment. Every sound could mean pursuit. Every shadow could conceal a stranger, a bounty hunter, or worse, someone who knew her secret and had chosen betrayal. She held Amelia close, feeling the child's small fingers clench in panic, and whispered assurances that were more for her own heart than the child's. They moved only when the light was dim, only when the patrols were least likely to be watching. Trees and fields became their allies, their trunks hiding them from eyes that might judge or condemn. Isabella had learned to read the land in ways most people could not, sensing where the ground softened, where streams would mask their scent, where the wind carried the odors of humans away. Every night was a lesson in patience and stealth, every day a trial of endurance and faith. Their first stop was a farmhouse barely visible from the road, where a single lantern glowed behind a curtained window. Isabella approached with the caution of a hunted animal, scanning the perimeter for signs of danger. A soft voice called from the side gate, the signal she had been taught. A woman emerged, gray-haired and sturdy, her eyes sharp but kind. She did not ask questions. She only led them inside, offering food, water, and a place to lie down while the sun crept over the fields. The farmhouse smelled of bread baking and wood smoke, ordinary comforts that seemed almost cruel in their unfamiliarity. Isabella rested her aching body and let Amelia sleep, but her mind could not rest. Every face she had ever known, every hand that had touched her, every command she had obeyed or resisted, flashed in her memory. The lives she had saved and the lives she had ended intertwined in a tangle she could not unravel. She did not apologize. There was no time for regret. Survival required clarity, and clarity required acceptance of the choices she had made. At dusk, they were moved again, this time under cover of darkness, to a waiting wagon concealed behind a grove of trees. A man named Garrett, whose hands bore scars from a life of toil and freedom, guided them with precise efficiency. His voice was calm, confident, a steady rhythm in a world that had none. He spoke little, but every word was a map, every instruction a lifeline. Isabella obeyed without hesitation, knowing that one misstep could end everything. Amelia clung silently, her eyes wide but trusting, sensing her mother's resolve and feeding off it. The journey through Tennessee's backroads was slow. The roads were uneven, the wagons creaking under weight, the horses restless. Isabella's body ached from cramped hiding, from constant vigilance, from the burden of responsibility that could not be shared. She had no choice but to keep moving, to keep her mind sharp, to remember the signals, the landmarks, the faces of those who could help. Every mile carried danger, but every mile also carried the possibility of freedom. Along the way, they encountered signs of the country's unrest, burnt-out barns, overturned carts, men arguing loudly over debts or crops, children running barefoot with wide, laughing eyes, unaware of the chains tightening elsewhere. Isabella watched them with a distant fascination, a reminder of the lives that could be lived if the world were different. She wished for Amelia to know such a life, to run through fields without fear, to touch the water without dread, to sleep without the constant knowledge of pursuit. By the third night, exhaustion had set in. Amelia's small body trembled, and Isabella's own strength was stretched to its limit. They rested briefly in a barn, hidden beneath hay and shadows, listening to the wind and the distant barking of dogs. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, imagining a place where her daughter could grow unshackled, where chains were stories told only in memory. That vision was enough to keep her moving, to steel her resolve when every muscle screamed in protest. They crossed rivers shallow enough to wade, followed tracks hidden by fallen leaves, and avoided roads where patrols might gather. Garrett's knowledge of the terrain was unmatched, guiding them through woods and fields, past human settlements without being seen. Each night, the danger grew. Each day, the road north seemed longer. Yet with each passing hour, freedom felt more tangible. Isabella whispered encouragements to Amelia, teaching the child the importance of silence, stillness, and observation. These lessons were born of terror but necessary for survival. By the time they reached the outskirts of Kentucky, signs of free communities appeared. Farmhouses with lanterns in windows, gardens tended carefully, horses grazing in fields. Each sight brought a spark of hope, a reminder that the world beyond chains existed and that they might reach it. Still, the river loomed ahead, a brown ribbon slicing across the land, both barrier and promise. Crossing it would be the final test, the ultimate gamble in a game of life and death. Isabella's hands tightened around Amelia, and she whispered a vow. They would reach the other side, or they would die trying. The road north had been cruel, treacherous, and exhausting, but it had taught them resilience. Each mile of hardship had strengthened their resolve, sharpened their instincts, and reminded them of what was at stake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Isabella and Amelia prepared for the river crossing, the last obstacle between them and the freedom they had been chasing for so long. Shadows stretched across the land, but Isabella's spirit burned brighter than the dark, guiding them toward the dawn they so desperately sought. The Ohio River stretched before them like a wall of shadowed water, dark and turbulent under the thin light of the crescent moon. Isabella pressed Amelia close, feeling the child's pulse against her chest, fast and uneven, a small drum of fear and hope. Every ripple seemed alive with threat, every current a potential trap. Garrett's small boat waited, barely visible, rocking gently at the riverbank. The faint sound of oars against wood was music and warning both, a reminder that the moment of truth had arrived. Isabella scanned the bank for signs of ambush. The woods were silent, unnaturally so, the usual night chorus of frogs and insects subdued by the weight of their flight. She had learned to listen, not only with ears but with every nerve in her body, feeling the land's tensions, sensing the unnatural stirrings of those who might be lying in wait. Amelia's small hand gripped hers tightly, nails pressing into her skin, a reminder of why she had risked everything. One false step, one sound, one breath too loud, and the river could swallow them or worse. The hunters could seize them before the water offered any mercy. They moved carefully into the boat, its wooden hull cold and rough under their palms. Garrett's eyes met Isabella's briefly, a silent acknowledgement of what they were about to do. There was no time for doubt, no space for hesitation. The river demanded courage, demanded trust, demanded total commitment. As the boat pushed off from the bank, Isabella's mind raced. She thought of every mile, every night spent hiding, every ration of food and sip of water, every hand that had guided them north. The journey had been a gauntlet, and now it came to its ultimate test. The current was stronger than it had appeared from the shore, tugging at the boat as if it knew the stakes. Isabella braced herself, muscles taut, her body a counterweight to the river's pull. Amelia whimpered softly but stayed quiet, sensing her mother's determination. Garrett rowed with steady rhythm, each stroke measured, every motion deliberate to minimize noise and disturbance. Isabella focused on the far shore, where the Morrison mill awaited, lights faint through the darkness but unmistakable, a beacon of hope. Halfway across, the boat lurched as it struck a hidden log. Water splashed against their sides, icy and violent, sending a shiver through Amelia and forcing Isabella to tighten her grip. Heart-hammering, she whispered reassurances, even as terror coiled in her stomach. The river seemed endless, an unrelenting test of faith, each second stretching into an eternity. She thought of the Thornfield household, the poison, the deaths, and the price she had already paid. Freedom felt no lighter for the weight of her choices, but it was the only path forward, the only promise worth the risk. Voices carried faintly across the water, distant and indistinct, yet enough to make Isabella stiffen. Slave catchers patrolled the opposite shore, rumors of hunters and informants adding tension to every moment. Garrett adjusted the oars, steering them through shadows, avoiding glare from lanterns, keeping the boat's presence almost invisible. Isabella's eyes never left the far bank. Each passing second brought them closer to either salvation or capture. She imagined the mill's doors opening, hands reaching for them, smiles instead of chains. Minutes felt like hours. Amelia trembled against her, quiet but alert, small body rigid with fear and exhaustion. Isabella whispered lullabies, half to calm the child, half to steady herself, to claim the courage she had long carried silently. The river tested them, swirling violently around submerged debris, threatening to capsize hope along with the boat. The air smelled of wet earth, river silt, and tension so thick it seemed to choke every breath. Yet they pressed on, each stroke moving them closer to the life Isabella had envisioned since the first day she resolved to run. Finally, the far shore approached. The faint outlines of the Morrison mill became clearer, the single lantern now a guiding star. Relief pressed against Isabella's chest, mingling with persistent fear. They were not safe yet. The river could still betray them. The night could still betray them, and the human world beyond was fraught with danger. But the sight of solid ground, of land they could touch, ignited a spark of possibility. She whispered to Amelia that they were almost there, almost free, and felt the child's trembling ease slightly in response. The boat scraped against the muddy bank. Garrett leapt to steady it, and Isabella lifted Amelia into her arms. They stepped onto solid ground, the mud cold and yielding beneath their feet. Every muscle screamed in exhaustion, but the relief was electric. Behind them, the river roared and churned, carrying away the echoes of pursuit, the traces of fear, leaving only the possibilities ahead. The mill doors opened, and arms reached for them, welcoming, not restraining. Isabella's heart pounded with disbelief and joy. They had crossed, survived, and arrived. The Morrison family led them inside, offering blankets, food, and water. Isabella sank to the floor, Amelia clinging to her, both shivering, both alive. For the first time in months, they breathed without immediate fear, listening to ordinary sounds, laughter, conversation, the faint tick of a clock, as if they were a form of music, a language of freedom. Isabella knew the danger had not ended, that bounty hunters and informants still threatened from afar. Yet in this moment she allowed herself to believe. Freedom, fragile and hard-won, had been claimed at last. Isabella held Amelia close, tears streaking mud and sweat from their faces, and whispered promises she would keep as long as she lived. No master would ever touch her daughter again. They were fugitives still, but fugitives in the direction of hope, walking toward a life defined not by chains or terror, but by choice. And though the past would never fully release its grip, the river had carried them from slavery's shadow into a dawn of possibility. They were free,